Hi, I'm Sean Kelleher. I'm the historian in the town of Saratoga, and I'm the vice president of the Saratoga County History Center. And I've been asked to make this presentation about Saratoga, a series of borderland conflicts. Normally, when we begin presentations, especially at the History Center, we like to start with a land recognition. So we gratefully acknowledge the Native people on whose ancestral homelands we gathered, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their homes in New York State today. So part of the reason for this talk is because of the beautiful vista at Mount McGregor. When you step out of the president's house, most people normally cross the street, they walk down the small path, and they see that beautiful vista of the upper Hudson Valley and the lower parts of Lake George. It is just fantastic. And there is so much history that happened in that vista. And that's part of what I'm going to try to talk about today. But that vista is there because of this natural right of way. It was made by the glaciers. It's something that a natural history historian would do a much better job, or a geologist, than I could. But we have these very, very rich paths. We have the Hudson River coming south to the Atlantic Ocean and going north up to Lake George, and then Lake George, there's a small portage to Lake Champlain, which flows north to the Richelieu River and interconnects with the St. Lawrence Seaway, which gives you access to both the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean. And then we have the only opening in the Appalachian mountain chain, the only natural opening, which is, of course, the Mohawk Valley. And all those three valleys all come together in the Albany general area, but that area includes Saratoga. And the view from Mount McGregor really shows you where it all comes together. And because of that, it's so rich in history. So we had Native people who were here prehistoric, before Europeans, and they used the land of Saratoga as hunting and fishing grounds. Some of the early names that they used are up on the screen. I'm probably going to mispronounce them, but there's Amahushtek, the place where small fish are caught, and that was used around 1620. Fitzjohn Winthrop in 1696 said that the river is as a great sea right in Saratoga because of the amount of fish. And then St. Isaac Jones, a little bit earlier in 1746, said Saratoga is a spot very remarkable as abounding in small fish the size of herring. Now, fishing at the time was very, very different than it is today because there was no Troy Dam, and all the fish and the eels would come right up the Hudson River and go up the tributaries, including the Battenkill and including Fish Creek. It made it a very, very valuable spot because there was a natural source of food. Later, the name Saratoga was given to the Hudson River by the Mohawks, meaning the hillside of a great river and the place of swift water. Now, the first European travelers, of course, was Champlain to the north and Henry Hudson to the south. It took roughly, doing my math right here, for 34 years after Champlain and Hudson, which all happened in the same year, 1690, to have a European in the Lake George Saratoga area that was recorded, and that was St. Isaac Jones, and he's credited for being the first European traveler in the area. He was, of course, a mission to the Mohawks, and ends up becoming a martyr for his work bringing Christianity to the Mohawks. I also really enjoy telling history the way that our early founders told the history. So I like using the rotunda of the Capitol as one of my spots to say, well, they thought it was important. We should think it's important. So in the rotunda of the Capitol in 1817, shortly after the War of 1812, the Congress commissioned 4 paintings by John Trumbull. And these 4 paintings included the Declaration of Independence, the surrender of General Burgoyne, the surrender of Lord Cornwallis, and General George Washington resigning his commission. Now, as a historian, I think they did a pretty good job, but I'm a little biased because Saratoga's there. They also did 4 scenes of early exploration. And they added them between 1840 and 1855, and one of them was the landing of Columbus. And here's a close-up of the landing of Columbus, one of our first explorers from Spain. And then, of course, 412 years ago, I think that's correct. No, that's probably not correct. I have to check my math on that one. Champlain and Hudson came through. It's amazing that it was the same year, and I am really going to check my math on this. Pardon me as I do this. Calculator, come on. There we go. Somebody's probably beating me all to this. I, of course, have to jump up and continue and continue and continue to get out of this. I don't even want to subscribe. Why is life so difficult? I'm going to go to my phone. Pardon me as I look this up real quickly. So we are in 2020. Of course, it's never going to work. And 1609. And that 413, I was a year off. 413 years we had Champlain and Hudson exploring the area. And of course, they kind of met a little bit differently. Hudson is over here on the left, and he met and he traded with the Native Americans. Oh, wait, he was Dutch. That's what they did. And Champlain, being French, got into a battle with the native people. So not the best of ways to start off. But basically in our area, we had 3 powers that were settling the area. We had the Dutch up the Mohawk Valley. We had the English, primarily in New England and southern colonies. And then we had the French who came in through Canada and the St. Lawrence Valley. So we had these 3 great countries, and then ultimately the English took over the Dutch, and our European settlement was the British and the French. And we have our typical map to show the English and the French. Of course, they went at things 2 different ways. The English established colonies, which is what you see along the Atlantic seaboard. And the French, for the most part, had a few colonies, but they basically extracted the natural resources out of the central part of the United States and traded with those. Now, I would be amiss if I didn't mention that there was another important power involved in this area, and that was the Native Americans. We had a very, very strong Iroquois confederacy. We had the Algonquins that were in the area, primarily New England, but they also reached into New York. And then there were other native tribes that were also very, very active. So when you look at this period, you have the English, you have the French, and you have the Native Americans, and they're all working together or separate to make to settle this area, to develop this area, they made history. And here's some more shots of some Native American reenactors, but they were very, very active in the Saratoga Borderlands. I am not great on my Native American history, but I've been learning a lot more. And basically, in the Saratoga area, it started off as Mohegans, and we know the last of the Mohegan, the famous 19th century story, but it was settled by Mohegans who had small camps. They fished and they farmed, but they were rather small, and then they were kind of pushed out by the Mohawks, and the Mohawks had larger settlements over in the Mohawk Valley, and then they would use the Saratoga area to come over to hunt fish. So they were more seasonal when they were over here. In this entire borderland area, though, we have to say, and when we're talking about Native Americans, there was a gigantic drop in Native American population as soon as the Europeans started to settle, because the Europeans' diseases went through the Native Americans. They had no immunity to these diseases, so they had a dramatic drop in their population. There was also a series of mourning wars and other beliefs that played out with this. So, and then there was King Phillips War in throughout New England, which basically pushed the native people out of New England, and they formed various camps or settlements. Some of them we know were the Schaghticoke. Schaghticoke is just over in Rensselaer County from Saratoga County, just over from Stillwater. So they had a lot of displaced people. And then the Schaghticokes down the road, and I'll talk a little bit about them as we go forward, became involved with the Stockbridge Indians. So the Saratoga Borderland is quite an area. And what do I mean by it? Well, Saratoga was kind of the frontier for the English colonies. The major English colony was Albany or Fort Orange, and then there was a number of families that were in Schenectady. That was a big border community. And then from that, there was an outside border to make sure that the French or the natives didn't come down. And it also provided a nice area for trading. And that's part of what Saratoga played north of Albany. There were similar communities like this out in the Mohawk Valley. So about 1685, we start to see the Saratoga land grant start to fill up. The land grant was given by the governor to a number of wealthy Dutch families from Albany, including Pieter and David Skylar. And a few years later, we see some families from Niskayuna and Half Moon and several French traders occupy the lots at Saratoga. So let me define a borderland a little bit more. And I should say that a lot of this borderland work has really been developed by researchers, David Preston and others, the Hartkin Group, but they all worked on contracts from the National Park Service in Saratoga. Since I'm telling the history, I can tell you the history from my viewpoint. There was not much work done on this borderland area within Saratoga until about 20 years ago. It was kind of an open area that people kind of saw a little bit in history books, but really the focus was on the French and Indian War and in Saratoga, the American Revolution. This earlier period really was not told very much. And then there was a book that came out by a historian in the area, Ted Corbett, that started to focus some attention towards this. Then the National Parks Service folks started to fund research in this area. So I want to mention Chris Martin and Chris Velosin. They're two staff members at the National Park who have been working on this issue for a number of years, and they brought in some great researchers, some great archaeologists to work on this, including David Preston. So it's really an exciting area. It's exciting research. I'm going to share a little bit of it, but I think what's most important is that in our communities, this is an area where research doesn't stop, where research is ongoing, and we are constantly telling new stories, finding new documentation about the history of our community. So what is a borderland? It's an ill-defined frontier. It's an area where there's a meeting of people and there's an intercultural exchange. It's a contested area between empires, in this case between the French and the Dutch English influence, along with the Native Americans, in particular the Iroquois. It's the space between national and imperial strongholds. And it's a border that sometimes regulates movement and trade and sometimes doesn't. So there's two well-known borderlands. One is the English-French Indians in the Great Lakes, and the other is the French Indians, American Spanish in the lower Missouri Valley. So this gives you a quick outline of how many conflicts happened basically under that view from Grant's Cottage. We start with the Beaver Wars. We continue with King William's War, Queen Anne's, King George's, then the French and Indian or 7 Years' War. Now, all those together are a little hard to remember. So as a historian, we call them the WAGs. William, Anne, George, and 7 Years' War for the French and Indian War. Then, of course, we have the Revolutionary War, and we have a little bit of the War of 1812. So this is this gigantic group of conflicts that happened right in the viewshed. So there's a total of 6 wars happening over 125 years. There's at least 10 military expeditions. These are, troops gathering up and marching either north or south. The number of battles, haven't been able to determine them, but there's a number. And there's a diverse community of Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and Europeans of different cultural and religious backgrounds. They settled here, they fought here, they made history here. So, the establishment of British supremacy in the area, let alone American independence, was far from a foregone conclusion during this period. And now the Saratoga, Stillwater, Scotticoke, because taking this from some local stuff, but if you continue up to Lake George and so on, it's the home of diverse populations of Native Americans, British, Dutch, French, and African American slaves. It's an amazing area. And I also want to mention, of course, that this is this rich natural right of way. And as you look at this map, you can start to see that there's a number of forts that are all established here. And you start to see these forts primarily at the strong points. So, and also at where things move back and forth. I'm going to try to move back to this last slide. I don't know if I can. All right. Well, I'm going to just mention that on the back and forth, that Albany and Montreal are the two strong points. So outside of Albany, you have some small forts. You have Saratoga, which is normally the borderland, but at other times Fort Edward is. It goes back and forth. You have a similar thing going out to the Mohawk Valley, where Fort Hunter is normally the outer fort. The Scotticoke Indians were really, really important. As I said, they were kind of in the Stillwater area, and they were a buffer zone. The thought was that Native Americans, the Mohawks, wouldn't attack other Native Americans. So they were a buffer, and they were a warning that if the Europeans came down, the Scotticokes would see them. They were paid to fight them, but they would also go and tell Albany what was going on. And you see the same thing up north. We have Montreal, and then you have Saint Jean along the Richelieu. And that's kind of the outer fort where everything starts from. And then the French came down and they established a fort at Crown Point to do further training. Further trade. So that was kind of their frontier, and that large area, really between Saratoga and St. Jean on the Richelieu, Saratoga on the Hudson, St. Jean on the Richelieu, was this borderland that was contested back and forth. And it's an interesting period, as we said, it's 125 years. And then, just because I'm a local guy, I need to mention that, of course, we have this strong natural right-of-way that I keep on pointing out between the three rivers, but we have shortcuts here in Saratoga. So I just want to point that out, that if you go north, you're going north right along the Hudson River. If you go out to the east along the Battenkill, you can travel to Vermont in the Connecticut Valley. If you go up Fish Creek to Saratoga Lake, there's some shortcuts to get to the Mohawk Valley. And further down, if you travel down through Stillwater and along the Hudson, you of course get to Albany. So that's really important. I also want to mention, and I don't think I can move myself from here. Nope. Right where I am in the map is the Hoosic River. So that's another shortcut to Vermont and the Connecticut River Valley. Okay, so this slide's probably not in the right spot, but what I'm trying to do is point out that there was 150 years between the founding of Massachusetts in 1775. I'm going to actually skip this. Other than this whole period is an era of benign neglect. And the frontiers and in the colonies, England really was not too secure, was not too focused on them, and they kind of let them run themselves. Wealth came from the land, and the English laws kind of became disregarded. And this becomes important as we get to the American Revolution, because for 150 years, the colonies just really didn't, they kind of did their own thing. And if you stop and think, there's 150 years there. If we think in our own history what 150 years is like, well, voting and civil rights acts were just passed after the Civil War, and we're in the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. That was 150 years ago. U.S. Grant was the president. I knew that would hit a responsive chord with this audience. College football had just started, and the Indian Wars are still going on, including Little Bighorn, 1876, and a person from my town, Saratoga, DeWitt Clinton, died in Little Bighorn. So we have these series of wars. I mentioned them, the Wags. They go back and forth, and ultimately the English are successful. But let's talk a little bit more about our pathway to war. We have, to start off with, 1666, we have 600 French and Algonquin soldiers. They're ambushed by the Mohawks near Schenectady, so they were coming down for some problems. They have a horrible winter time. They came down in the winter. They had a horrible time getting back, but that's one of the first battles that happened. And then 1689, 1,300 Mohawks attacked the French in Canada, and they kill over 100, and they take over 100 captives. This taking of captives during this war, and during these colonial wars, is one of those things that you see happen a lot. Now, before 1690, a blockhouse was established with Dutch soldiers to protect 8 or so families at Saratoga, and it's the house of Bartel Vrooman. It's largely a supply depot for Winthrop's expedition against Canada. This is one of those expeditions in the 1690s that aren't really talked much about. Winthrop was a governor. He gathered up a group of troops that were going to go invade Canada. They never got much further than Whitehall or Skenesborough, but the area was a supply depot. And then in 1691, Skylar led an expedition with 120 soldiers and 135 river Indians, meaning Indians, Algonquins, for the most part, along the Hudson River. And they went up, and this is a little unusual, and I hope I have this right, because for the most part, the British, and Schuyler, although a Dutch name, was working for the British, normally they worked with the Mohawks, the Iroquois. So they go up and they attack the areas outside of Montreal, and they're quite successful. Now, our first settlements in the area, we have the Patton, and then, as I mentioned before, around 1698, there's 7 families. The only name that was passed down was Bartel Vrooman. They were French refugees. 1703, there's a few more families. But one of those things that becomes really important for Saratoga is what happens in 1689. 1689, the governor of New York, Lesser, writes that there are 6 or 7 families, almost or all rank French Papist, and they have their relations with Canada, and I suppose they settled there at Saratoga for bad designs and are less to be trusted than in conjunction of the time than ever before. Bad creatures among us give us great occupation. So he didn't trust the people in Saratoga. As I mentioned, it's really an important period for 1689 because there's an established farmstead. There's a fur trading post at Saratoga, and it's also the year of the Glorious Revolution in England, where there's a change in the king, and accompanying that, there's a revolt in Boston, and there's Lisler's rebellion in New York. 1689 also kind of begins about 100 years of intermittent warfare between the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, the English, and the French. Now, thanks to geography, Saratoga is at the northern Anglo-Dutch settlement of Saratoga's borderland. It's on the front line of intense military and diplomatic, and it has a central role in the illicit fur trade. Now, let me explain what was going on during this period. The fur trade was really important. That is where great wealth was gathered, was through the fur trade. So what happened is that the fur trade in and around the Albany area, in and around the Montreal area, that was all hunted out. There was no more fur trade. The fur trade came from the Great Lakes and down into the Ohio Valley. So people had to go further for their fur trade. Now, for the most part, there were fur trappers and there were Native Americans who were doing that. And then they had their choice. As they're coming back, for the most part, they're supposed to go to Montreal, but they're after the best price. So initially, out in the Rome, New York area, um, the English set up, or the Albany folks set up a fur trading spot there. So the French, or the trappers and the natives, could come down from Lake Oswego down and trade there. They also had the choice of trading around the Fort Hunter, Johnstown area, or they could continue up the St. Lawrence and trade in Montreal. And sometimes people got to Montreal and they still weren't happy with the prices, so they could come down again that natural corridor and they could trade at Saratoga. Now, none of this trading was supposed to happen. It was all set up that for the French, all the trading was supposed to happen at Montreal. So if you were French, you captured your beaver pelt, you had to go to Montreal and you had to pay the list price. And for the English, they wanted the trading to happen at their official areas. So initially that was in Rome, New York, and then they established another trading post up in Oswego, and those all funneled into Albany, and Albany was the spot that things were supposed to happen in. So that was the plan. Didn't always happen, and Saratoga was definitely not part of the plan. But it still happened, and that's where some of the problems came in. And the governors tried to limit the trade going on here in Albany. So, as we said, the other important thing with this fur trade is, well, two important things. One important thing with the fur trade is what was the most valuable commodity at the time were trade beads, wampum, and they were made in Albany, and they were the best quality. So these were shells that would be carved and colored, and Albany was the best source for that. So that's what people were looking for. So that's why the trade came into this area. Now, we mentioned that there were French trading in the area. We have the new governor, and he ended up bringing the French traders to Albany to investigate them. The traders didn't particularly like being questioned by the Albany officials, and most of them, or some of them, returned to New France. There are only 4 of them, and one stayed in Albany and continued to trade in Saratoga and Albany. Ruman, seeing the opportunity, was credited as the last person. He was Dutch. He was born in Holland. He came over, established the farmstead. His father was in Schenectady, and he made a small little fort in Saratoga. They had a garrison of 12 men and some Native Americans, primarily Scaticoke Indians, and they were protecting the farmstead and the various families in the area. So there was a small raid that happened, and the Vrooman family moved to Schenectady, where their father still lived. And it was a faithful one, because in 1690, A large French force with over 200 Canadians and Indians were able to avoid the Saratoga garrison and strike at Schenectady without warning. Schenectady was destroyed. The French and their Native Americans killed some 60 people, including Vrooman and his father. So Vrooman went to Schenectady for safety, and he found nothing but. So, as we continue on our pathway of wars, 1709, there's a fort built on the east side of the river, and the military road gets established between Saratoga and Fort Edward. In 1711, there's an invasion of Canada, but with 3,000 troops, which is amazing, but they never made it past Lake George. 1745, there's the destruction of Saratoga with 109 captives. I'm going to talk a lot about that. 1746, the Fort Clinton is built in Saratoga. In 1747, the French attack Saratoga again. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about 1745 and the War of Austrian Succession, also known as King George's War in the British colonies. It's a fascinating period of time. I can say that I've probably spent easily the last 30 years kind of interested in and studying this King George's War. And the first major military campaign that happens in 1745 is that the New Englanders attack Louisburg. Now, this is a fascinating campaign. What ends up happening is that the New England governors, knowing that there's a war with the French, want to establish fishing rights in the Georges Bank. And they keep on getting challenged by the French out of this fortress up in Nova Scotia called Louisburg. It was a fantastic, huge fortress. So they decide, the governors decide to raise an army. They involve, they make it into a religious war because they're, of course, all Protestants. And up in Louisburg, they're French Catholics, or Papists as they were known. So they go up to this little community that was attacked. It was a New England community in Nova Scotia called Canso. They establish themselves on a small island, and they decide we don't have enough troops. So they send back down to New England. They get some more troops. They come up and they start to lay siege on Louisburg. And there's some things that happen that are just kind of amazing. So Louisburg is this gigantic fort. You have a group of basically militia troops who were just raised for this campaign with a few pieces of artillery laying siege, extended supply lines. They don't feel like they're going to be very successful. But as they start to attack and they start to hit the fortifications, what they didn't know is that the fortifications were put together with concrete using salt water from the ocean there. So they start to crumble. The French give up one of their fortifications, this huge artillery battery, and they spike the cannons. Well, the New Englanders capture those cannons. They pull the spikes out, which the French didn't think was possible. They happen to have cannonballs of the same size, and they start using the French cannons against them. Finally, as they're about to close the battle off, two things happen. They get to this point of land, and they need some more artillery pieces to man this siege. And they look into the water, and it happened to be the same spot that the French beached their boats, took off their cannons, and scraped the barnacles and shells and fixed the bottoms of their boats. So there was a bunch of cannons just laying in the water. So they took those cannons and used them against the French. And a British fleet showed up at the same time. So they were able to capture this fortification. Unfortunately, the British fleet takes all the prizes that are in the fort. The New Englanders get very, very little looting because the British Navy did all the better looting. And the New Englanders have to spend the entire winter up in Louisburg, which is a horrible spot to spend the winter. They had horrible diseases and so on. this becomes a gigantic conflict between the New Englanders and the British crown, and this continues on until just before the American Revolution. It becomes really, really important. But two other important people are involved in this. There's Vice Admiral Sir Peter Warren. Peter Warren is in charge of that British fleet, and he makes an awful lot of money as an admiral, capturing prizes and looting towns and so on. And he makes a number of wise investments. He gets into money lending, but one of those things that he invests in is land in the Mohawk Valley, and he sends his nephew to develop that land in the Mohawk Valley. Who's his nephew? Johnson, Sir William Johnson, who of course is very, very famous for his dealings with Native Americans, the fur trade, and his military efforts during the during the French and Indian War. So all this is tied together. There was another British officer who helped out an awful lot with this. He was a prisoner at Louisburg, came up with a plan on how to assault Louisburg, and his name was John Bradstreet. John Bradstreet's best friend is Philip Schuyler. John Bradstreet in the French and Indian War is the quartermaster general, and he teaches Schuyler how to become a very, very good quartermaster. One of Schuyler's children is named John Bradstreet Schuyler. John Bradstreet also lives at the Schuyler house for a number of years, is good friends with Schuyler's wife, and just an amazing person. And in military history, they say amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. John Bradstreet was a logistics master, and he taught Philip Schuyler to do the same thing. But this all happens in the summer of 1745. As it starts to get towards winter, the French decide they need a counterattack, and they work with a number of Native Americans, and they decide that their counterattack, well, ultimately, they raise a force of French and Native Americans. Native Americans, many of them come from a Mohawk community known as Gahiwake. Out of the French that came, many of them are junior officers. So they're teenagers, kind of learning their name, or learning their way. One of them is Jumonville, and there are other young French officers, and they all play important roles at the beginning of the French and Indian War. If you remember your history, George Washington was involved at the beginning of the French and Indian War, and that supposedly, and he was brought up in the courts of France for this, there was a war crime that happened in front of him. There was a French diplomat who happened to be an officer, a French officer by the name of Jumonville, who came to talk to Washington, and a Native American just hatcheted him right in front of Washington. They never got to negotiate or talk or anything. That was Jumonville. And then there is the whole ambush that happens with Braddock. Again, that many of the officers that were involved in that ambush were young cadets on this raid in 1745. So in 1745, they come down, they get to the Lake Champlain, and they're trying to figure out where to go. Their original thought was to go down across into the Connecticut River Valley, but some of the Native Americans said, nah, Saratoga is a great place to attack. So they came down. There was no warning. They were lying in Fish Creek waiting for sunrise, and they attacked. And they attacked at just the right time. They ended up burning the first Schuyler house. They ended up killing Philip Schuyler's uncle in that house. They killed a number of people, but for some reason, and we can just assume this was early December, that it was because of Logging. There were over 100, I hope I have that number right, it was somewhere between 60 and 100 slaves at Saratoga, all working. Nobody owned 100 slaves. So these were borrowed from other people, all brought together. We believe that they were logging at Saratoga, and they were all made captives, and they were brought back up to Canada. Now, one of the folks that was made captive was this young man. He was born about 1741, but might have been a little bit earlier, because remember, this is 1745, and he becomes known as Colonel Louis Cook. He's a Native American. He's half Native American. He is half African American. Now, I am just learning his history, but he's one of the most fascinating men that I've seen. And at the History Center, we're doing some active research on him. He gets captured by a French officer who wants to make him his slave. His mother appeals to the Mohawks and say, whoa, he's not African American, he's Native American, because he's mixed race. So he is freed from that, and he goes on to live in the Gahiwake community. He becomes a big fan of the French. He doesn't like the English. He gets very, very involved in the French and Indian War, and then in the American Revolution. Here is another Trumbull painting of him. So this is the Trumbull, whoops, the last picture was the Trumbull sketch. Here is a Trumbull painting of the death of Montgomery up in Quebec, and the Native American that's here. Here is a close-up of him, and that is Louis Cook. Louis Cook spoke perfect French. He becomes involved with the Native Americans, and I am blanking on their name. I'll come up with it in just a second. From Central New York, who are our allies in the American Revolution, and they he kind of leads a party of them at the battles of Saratoga. He is known to Washington. He is part of the Mohawks that go out and meet Washington during the siege of Boston in 1775. He's a personal friend of Philip Schuyler's, and he goes down and meets the French when they arrive in 1778 in Newport and speaks fluent French to them. 1778 is not right, 1780. So he is really, really an important man. The Oneidas. Pardon me for forgetting. It's the Oneidas. It's the Oneidas that I'm thinking of. So Peter Cook becomes involved with the Oneidas. Fascinating man. Here's some correspondence between Washington and Schuyler in 1779, talking about Colonel Louis and concerned about his health. Okay, our next stop in this method is, I'm going to give this a very, very short trip, is in our area, Fort Hardy gets built. We have the French and Indian War. Here's some pictures of Fort Hardy, which was basically a supply depot, and here's some computer drawings of it. So along the Hudson River, wherever there was rapids, there would be a fort to protect the supplies. Wherever there needed to be a portage, there would be a fort. Fort Hardy was Saratoga's version of that, and it was just a supply depot in support of Fort Edward. Fort Edward was the major fort in this area. So there were a number of supply depots, one in Stillwater, one up in Fort Miller, and Fort Hardy was Saratoga's version of it. And here's a better outline, including the street that you see right here. That is Route 29. And we also start to have some permanent settlement, especially after the French and Indian War. Now, I really gave the French and Indian War a short explanation, but you know, this area was the cockpit for the French and Indian War. Controlling Fort George, I'm sorry, controlling Lake George was very important, and then taking Ticonderoga, which controlled Lake Champlain and the portage of Lake Champlain. So those were two important areas. The French fought valiantly. The English had some major losses, but ultimately were successful, and ultimately had control of this region. Just wanted to mention that some of the permanent settlements, this is one of a colonial house that we think was similar to Skylar's house. This was William Dewar's house up in Fort Miller. And this is the Skylar Plantation. So after the French and Indian War, there was great growth in the area. This would be the Skylar House, and this was, I believe, his Dutch barn, mills along the river, and other outbuildings, all important in making Skylar the richest man in Albany. And what he did is he took advantage of those fish that we had talked about earlier. He took advantage of the rich agricultural valley that is in the area along the Hudson River, and he took advantage of the timber, and he had sawmills, one here and one further up the river, to saw timber into boards, making barrels, making whatever needed to happen. This was very, very important for his wealth. Saratoga, Schuylerville today, we think of it as a bedroom community. Good schools, nice bedroom community. And we might think back of some of the old mills that were there in the 19th and early 20th century. Well, Schuyler started all those mills, and most importantly, Saratoga was really a frontier fort in a large Atlantic world. There was trading going on from here down to the Caribbean. This time period, in the middle of the 18th century, during the French and Indian War, there is a trade, or there is a change in what gives value and what is valuable. We talked about how important the beaver trade was early on. Well, that changed, and that changed to the sugar trade, and the Caribbean became much more important, and it was the rum from the sugar trade that was very, very important. So that is where Schuyler focused, was on his rum, was on the trade with the Caribbean, because that's where the value was. And what did the Caribbean have? Well, we know that they had the sugar, they had the slaves, and that was money in the bank. What they didn't have, and what they were willing to trade for, was wood and food to feed those slaves. And that's what Schuyler provided. So we have Saratoga as a little frontier fort, a little frontier port in the Atlantic world. And from here, Schuyler is taking fish, he's taking wood, and he's trading it with the Caribbean that doesn't have food, that doesn't have wood, they're just creating sugar. and its payments are in sugar, sometimes in slaves, and he brings them back to New York sometime, and then he trades them for finished goods, which he brings up here and uses or sells. So we are all interrelated, unfortunately, with the slave trade. Here's another picture of some of those mills and industry and the large house, and you can see some of the crops growing behind here. Here's another perspective of a water wheel in one of the mills, and some more. And this is it laid over the current streetscape. This is the Skylar House. This is Route 4. Locally, this is Burgoyne, the road up to the Saratoga Monument, and you can see the various houses and mills along the way. Okay, I'm going to skip real quickly into the fight for independence. So, in our valley, we had the fight for independence going on. And as part of this fight for independence, in the third year of the war, 1777, the British were looking for the knockout punch. General John Burgoyne spent the winter kind of dealing with grieving his wife that had just passed in 1776, but he also got an audience with Lord Germain, who was in charge of all North American activities. He was the minister for North America, and King George. And he came up with this plan where he was going to separate the New England colonies, where they felt many of the troubles were, with the rest of the colonies by using the natural waterways. So the plan was that he would lead a British army that's already up here in Canada. It's under another general's name, under another general. He was going to take that Carleton, he was going to take that army from him and lead that south and form a junction in Albany. That the army in New York City under General Howe would make a movement north under and make a junction in Albany. And then a smaller army led by a lieutenant colonel who was made brigadier, St. Leger, would lead the smaller army, a diversion army, in off of Lake in by Oswego and down to the Mohawk Valley, capture Fort Schuyler, and make a juncture with the two other armies in Albany. That was the plan. And it started off really well. Burgoyne led this great fleet. He gained it all together at St. John. He came down the Richelieu, down Lake George, and he came to Fort Ticonderoga, known to New Englanders as the Gibraltar of North America. And he wasn't sure how to get by it. So he started to move troops around. He put some men, the folklore is he was led by his second in command, General Phillips, who was an artillery officer, up on Mount Defiance, and they figured out that they could get an artillery piece up there and that their artillery could lead into Fort Ticonderoga. Ultimately, the defenders of Fort Ticonderoga decided that they could not defend it. So St. Clair, the colonel in charge there, led a retreat. They did what the Americans had done a lot during the war. They started a lot of fires at night. They made it look like they were spending the night, and then they retreated. And so they retreated down a very narrow road. The British kind of caught them at sunrise and chased after them. And shortly afterwards, in a little crossroads in Hubbardton, Vermont, there was a battle there. It was a rear guard action, the American rear guard against the advance guard of the British, and the British were successful. But the Americans kept on retreating. And they kept on retreating and retreating and delaying Burgoyne down through Skenesboro, Whitehall, Fort Anne to Fort Edward. Burgoyne made a tactical decision to send some of his troops towards Bennington, Vermont, to capture American supplies and to get more recruits. They were told that loyalists would join them. They were also looking for horses. And on their way to Bennington, Vermont, they ran into a number of New England militia troops led by John Stark. John Stark was an honorary veteran of the French and Indian War from New Hampshire. He was ready to fight somebody and was more than happy to fight Burgoyne. And on a very, very hot August day, the two armies fought. It was bloody, it was hand to hand, and John Stark and his New Englanders won the day. Burgoyne's army was smaller, they lacked the supplies, but he made a decision that he had to go forward, and he was going towards Albany. Ultimately, he crossed the Hudson River and he started to move. There were two set battles in the battles of Saratoga. He heard that the troops that were coming in through the Mohawk Valley were not successful. They couldn't capture Fort Skylar. Benedict Arnold and a relief column of New Englanders went out, and St. Leger went back up into Canada and ultimately came over to Fort Ticonderoga to support Burgoyne. The troops down in Philadelphia, the Howe brothers, it was a general and an admiral, made a decision, a smart decision, that they were going to go invade up the Chesapeake and Delaware rivers and capture the colonial capital of Philadelphia, try to capture Congress. And they were extremely successful. They captured Philadelphia. They sent a much smaller army up north to support Burgoyne. They were successful. They captured the West Point area. They captured Kingston. But they weren't enough to help Burgoyne out. Burgoyne, as I said, fought two battles. Number of skirmishes. He was in a bad spot after the second battle. So he decided to retreat, going north, trying to get to a point where he could have better terrain for himself. And that was in Saratoga, the Schuylerville area. And through that, he decided that it was time. Oh, he was encircled. He was encircled by the Americans, and he played for some time back and forth, but ultimately he ended up surrendering. And the upper painting here, which you've seen a number of times, is a picture of his surrender that's in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. So that changed world history. It's the first time in world history a complete British army surrendered, and it's basically in the viewshed of Mount McGregor. It also changed the world because the French allies, and here's a picture of a French officer, joined in with the Americans, and shortly after the Dutch and the Spanish did. It changed the world because then it became a worldwide war. There was fighting in India, there was fighting in Africa, there was fighting, there was a concern that France was going to invade England right over the channel, and most importantly, there was fighting in the Caribbean. Caribbean, remember, is where money was made during this period. Then in 1781, a second complete British army surrendered in Yorktown, and that was basically the end of the war. The war continued for a couple of years, but once you had the international support, the British were done for. And they ultimately made a decision based on money. The Caribbean was too valuable to them. They didn't want to give it up. They could give up their American colonies, but they still had Canada, but they did not want to give up the Caribbean. Also on this pathway of war that we've talked about, going to just quickly mention the War of 1812. It never got down to our viewshed because the Canadians, the British, were going to invade, again, the natural pathways, but they didn't invade because of the Battle of Plattsburgh. Some people call that the turning point of the War of 1812, but it was the USS Saratoga, the naval ship up on Lake Champlain, that stopped the French invasion. Very important. And ultimately, we won our independence. So that's a little brief overview of all the different wars. I didn't give enough time to the French and Indian War. I strongly suggest that you go up, that the Lake George battlefield has a brand new visitor center up in Lake George. There's some nice displays up there. If you're interested in the French and Indian War in our time period, I would strongly recommend visiting there. I hope you've learned a little something. If you have an interest, you can contact me at the History Center in Ballston Spa. Just go to our website, www.brookside.org. brooksidemuseum.org. And thank you very much. I hope you all have a great day.